House policy of January 3rd, 2025, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and still I rise, and still I rise. Unbought, unbossed, unelected, liberated Democrat. And I rise today, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the fact that I have been censured by this House, censured but not silenced. And I rise today, Mr. Speaker, because the housing crisis that we confront has taken on a new dimension. I am in full support of the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, full support of it. Many others are. But I rise today to announce...
What's happening, people? Welcome to Jack Mockler again. In moments of maximum Trump accountability crisis, Capitol Hill takes on a distinct atmosphere, late-night sessions, members sleeping in offices, 2 a.m. floor speeches, and urgent leadership huddles working the math. This is the same charged environment that preceded both of Trump's previous impeachments and the January 6th aftermath, when leadership publicly committed to acting before morning. And it is the atmosphere that the current moment, with 140 House members having voted to advance impeachment articles, with new articles addressing fresh conduct that Democrats argue crosses the constitutional threshold, with floor speeches and procedural fights, and the specific quality of overnight urgency that the Capitol ERUPTS framing is designed to capture, is recreating in forms that are both familiar from the previous rounds.
That this is now the Trump housing crisis. It is the Trump housing crisis, and I should like to present evidence to substantiate my claim. It's the Trump housing crisis because on yesterday, the president declined to sign the bicameral, the bill that was voted on in this House and passed, in the Senate and passed, bicameral bill. Rarely do we get such a thing, but this one also is bipartisan, has huge Republican support, huge Democratic support. Let me read from an official document. This is from congress.gov. The indication here is that this piece of legislation had 191 Democrats to vote for it, 166 Republicans to vote for it, total of 358.
And freshly urgent because of the specific conduct that is driving the current escalation. The before morning framing is both the most honest available description of the atmosphere and an acknowledgement that the formal constitutional process, whatever the atmosphere demands, operates on its own timeline. The eruption is real, the fury is documented, and the question of what the overnight energy can produce through the formal mechanisms of House procedure is the question that the people in those late-night rooms are trying to answer right now. President Trump is calling for Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin to be removed from Congress.
For the legislation, that is the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. In the United States Senate, it had 85 yeas, only 5 nays. In the United States Senate, overwhelming support. The kind of support that would cause people to come to the floor of the House of Representatives as they did. I was here, came to the floor of this House of Representatives, and many persons on both sides of the aisle talked about the collegiality, perhaps not using that exact word, but the collegiality. Talked about how this was one of the rare moments when we have received this bipartisan, bicameral support for a piece of legislation, a great piece of legislation, I might add. A piece of legislation that was a long time in the making. A piece of legislation that this House passed and the Senate passed, as I've indicated before, by large margins. But I heard persons stand here at this podium and at that podium and at the podium in the well
The president made those comments in a Truth Social post, criticizing Raskin's past efforts to impeach him and calling him a loser. Raskin recently pushed legislation targeting Trump's policy agenda. The president's remarks came in response to a conservative commentator also calling for Raskin to be expelled. Raskin has not directly responded to those latest comments, but had previously mocked the president over inflation concerns. To understand why the before-morning impeachment demand generates the specific quality of political urgency that the headline is capturing, why the overnight framing is both accurate as a description of the atmosphere and complicated as a description of the formal process,
and proclaim that this piece of legislation was indicative of what we can do when we work together. The symbiosis that was created by Democrats and Republicans working together. Everyone was in a great mood, a celebratory mood. Persons were ready to move on to the next phase. After all, you have to have the House, the Senate, to pass a piece of legislation. And there are many people who say that before you can get a House and a Senate to pass a bill, they first have to have the will. They demonstrated the will after having negotiated for some time. That was the first phase of it. The first phase of it included some persons who are of note and should be mentioned. The Honorable Maxine Waters should be mentioned. She and the Honorable Elizabeth Warren, the two of them, they worked together to bring this to fruition. They worked together after a chasm had erupted as it relates to the bill.
You have to understand the relationship between congressional urgency and constitutional procedure and how that relationship has played out across the multiple rounds of Trump impeachment action that have now accumulated in the historical record. The Constitution does not require impeachment to be slow. The fastest impeachment in American history happened in 2021, 7 days from the Capitol attack to the House vote. The procedural requirements for impeachment can be compressed when leadership decides that the urgency of the situation warrants compression, when the Rules Committee grants a rule that accelerates the process, when articles are brought to the floor under procedures that minimize deliberation.
There was a chasm that many thought would be impossible to scan, but I called them the W's. The W's, Waters, and the Honorable Maxine Waters, I always say that because I have such great respect for her, and the Honorable Elizabeth Warren, the Honorable Elizabeth Warren, I have great respect for her. They were able to expand this chasm and make this difference. I would also mention that in the Senate, it had bipartisan support because the majority leader and the leader of the Senate, the majority leader and the minority, they both signed off on it. This was something that took great work to accomplish. And I would also add this, it took people who were experienced. This is one of those times when experience with legislation made a difference. I'm not sure that a neophyte could pull off what they were able to accomplish. And I'm very proud to say that I support what they've done. I support the bill.
And maximize speed when the specific political will exists to treat the formal process as something that needs to match the urgency of the moment rather than something that exists on its own deliberate schedule. The before-morning framing is the expression of that political will, the demand that the procedural timeline match the urgency of the conduct that is prompting the demand. Whether the procedural timeline actually does match that urgency depends on the specific political conditions of the moment and on the specific calculations of leadership about whether the procedural accelerations required to meet the before-morning deadline are achievable and politically sustainable. The 140 votes to advance the Al Green impeachment articles in December 2025 is the specific formal action that gives the current round of impeachment eruption its most solid constitutional grounding and its most direct connection to the documented institutional record. When the 140 members of the House vote on the floor to advance impeachment articles in a formal floor vote, with each member's position documented in the permanent congressional record, Through the specific constitutional mechanism that the House has available for considering whether to advance articles to the full chamber, the process that produces that vote is not political theater. It is the House formally exercising its constitutional authority to consider articles of impeachment through the mechanisms that House rules provide. It is elected representatives making formal, recorded, legally significant institutional choices about the most consequential constitutional question available to the legislative branch. The specific articles that attracted those 140 votes cited Trump's calls for the execution of lawmakers and his threats against federal judges as the specific abuses of power that warranted the constitutional response. That those articles attracted nearly 2/3 of the Democratic caucus in a formal floor vote is a measure of how seriously the members voting on those articles assess the gravity of the conduct being described. These are not 140 members expressing general dissatisfaction with the president's politics. These are 140 members making the formal constitutional determination that specific documented conduct, threats against lawmakers, threats against judges, conduct that has generated documented real-world consequences for the safety of the people being threatened, crosses the line from political conduct to impeachable abuse of power. The before-morning urgency that the current moment is generating is built on the foundation of that formal vote, on the institutional record that the 140 members created when they put themselves on the record as supporting the advancement of impeachment articles against the sitting president, whose conduct they formally concluded warranted the most serious constitutional response available to the House. The specific way that live coverage of the House impeachment process, the floor speeches, the procedural fights, the whip count updates, the leadership statements, creates the Capitol erupts atmosphere for the viewing public watching on live streams is itself one of the more interesting features of the contemporary impeachment dynamic. The formal procedural process of House consideration of impeachment articles involves committee markups, floor debates, amendments, procedural motions, and the specific parliamentary choreography that governs how the House moves major legislation. None of those procedural elements is individually dramatic in the way that a criminal verdict or a courtroom confrontation is dramatic. But the cumulative effect of hours of live coverage, the building sense that the formal process is moving toward a specific outcome, the floor speeches that vary between the eloquent and the incendiary, the visible tension on the faces of members who are making consequential political decisions in real time, creates exactly the kind of sustained dramatic narrative that the Capitol erupts framing is describing. The eruption is the live television and live stream presentation of a formal constitutional process, the translation of parliamentary procedure into the dramatic language of political crisis that the public is watching for, and that the before-morning framing is designed to sustain. The comparison to January 2021, the specific historical precedent that gives the current overnight impeachment urgency its most powerful resonance, reveals why the eruption atmosphere has the specific quality it does and why the before-morning framing carries the specific weight that it carries in the current political moment. After the January 6th Capitol attack, Pelosi held a call with her caucus and used language that was explicitly urgent in its framing of both the threat and the timeline. "He must be removed," she said. "We cannot wait. Democrats will act with urgency because this president is an imminent threat to the country." Those words spoken by the Speaker of the House in the immediate aftermath of an attack on the building where she worked were not political theater. They were the expression of a person who had just personally experienced the consequences of the conduct she was describing as impeachable, and who was using her institutional authority and political will to accelerate the formal process to match the urgency she believed the situation demanded. The result was the fastest impeachment in American history. The atmosphere that produced it, the overnight urgency, the leadership determination, the before-morning sense that the formal process had to match the scale of the crisis, is the atmosphere that the Capitol erupts framing is trying to recreate in the current political context. and the specific conduct that is driving the current round of urgency, the threats against judges, the calls for the execution of lawmakers, the pattern of presidential conduct that 140 members formally concluded warranted impeachment, is the specific conduct that the comparison to January 2021 is meant to evoke as the closest available precedent for the current moment. Now let us examine the specific mechanics of what the before-morning impeachment demand can actually produce through the formal constitutional and procedural channels available to the House, and why the relationship between the urgency of the atmosphere and the timeline of the formal process is as politically significant as the substance of the articles being filed. The House of Representatives has specific and well-developed procedural mechanisms for accelerating the consideration of urgent matters. The Rules Committee can grant rules that bring articles to the floor on an expedited timeline. Leadership can invoke procedures that limit debate and minimize the procedural obstacles that would normally slow the movement of major legislation through the chamber. The Speaker can schedule votes at any hour of the day or night. The January 2021 second impeachment was held on a Wednesday afternoon that had been a Wednesday morning less than a week earlier when the planning for it began. The formal constitutional process is not inherently slow. It has been made fast before. The question is whether the specific political conditions of the current moment, the specific majority configuration, the specific leadership calculations, the specific political costs, and benefits of the procedural accelerations required make the before-morning timeline achievable in its most literal form, or whether the overnight urgency is better understood as a description of the atmosphere that is generating the formal process rather than a literal prediction of when the formal process will produce a result. The specific whip count dynamics that are always the most important practical question in any serious impeachment effort are worth examining in the current context because they determine the specific form that the Capitol erupts energy can take through the formal channels available to the House, and because they reveal the specific structural constraints that the overnight urgency has to navigate in order to produce the formal constitutional outcomes that the before-morning demand is calling for. A simple majority of the House, 218 votes in the current configuration, is what is required to pass articles of impeachment and transmit them to the Senate for trial. In the current Congress, Democrats do not hold the majority. The Republican majority has the institutional power to prevent the articles from coming to the floor for a full House vote through the Rules Committee and through the procedural mechanisms that the majority controls as a matter of right in the parliamentary system the House operates under. That is the specific structural constraint that the 140 vote floor result on the Green articles was navigating, a minority party using the procedural tools available to it, including privileged resolutions that force floor consideration regardless of the majority's preferences on scheduling, to advance articles even in the absence of the majority control that would be required to bring them to a floor vote under normal circumstances. The 140 votes that the Green articles attracted represent the maximum achievable formal support within the structural constraints that the current Congress imposes. They are not nothing. They are a formal floor vote with documented member positions that constitutes a real constitutional action, but they are also not a majority. And the gap between 140 and 218 is the specific structural gap that the before-morning eruption energy has to close in order to produce the formal majority vote that would constitute the House passing articles of impeachment. In the most constitutionally meaningful sense, that gap is not insurmountable in principle. It has been closed before by specific political developments that changed the calculus of enough Republicans to produce the bipartisan majority that the second Trump impeachment achieved. It requires either the political conditions to shift or the conduct being addressed to escalate to a point where enough Republicans conclude that the institutional obligation of constitutional action and oath outweighs the political cost of crossing the party line on impeachment. That structural constraint does not make the before-morning impeachment demand meaningless or purely theatrical. The formal floor vote that 140 members participated in is a real constitutional action with real accountability consequences. The floor speeches that are being delivered in the current moment are creating a real political record of what members believe about the conduct being described and what they believe the constitutional response should be. The leadership statements that are being made in the context of the current escalation are creating real political commitments that will shape how the caucus responds to subsequent developments. And the specific conduct that is being cited in the current round of articles, the threats against judges, the calls for the execution of lawmakers, the pattern of executive conduct that Democrats are characterizing as an escalating constitutional crisis, is creating the specific political and constitutional record that will be the foundation for any subsequent formal action if and when the specific circumstances change in ways that make a majority vote achievable. The before-morning framing's relationship to the 25th Amendment track, the parallel constitutional mechanism for urgent presidential removal that does not require the two-thirds Senate supermajority that impeachment conviction requires, is worth examining because it is the specific mechanism that the overnight urgency of the demand most directly implies. If the concern is that the president is so dangerous that he cannot be allowed to remain in office for another day, the constitutional mechanism that is most specifically designed for that kind of urgency is the 25th Amendment's fourth section, the provision that allows the vice president and a cabinet majority to transfer power immediately before any congressional action by transmitting a declaration to Congress. The before-morning removal scenario that the impeachment urgency is expressing would be achievable through that mechanism in a way that it could not be achievable through the impeachment track, which requires a House vote and a Senate trial that cannot constitutionally be completed in a single night. The Democratic leaders who frame their impeachment demands in overnight terms are implicitly recognizing that the most urgent removal pathway is the cabinet and vice president track, and they are using the impeachment demand as political pressure on the cabinet officials who hold the constitutional keys to the faster mechanism. The specific floor speeches that characterize the before-morning impeachment sessions, the late-night oratory that the Capitol erupts, atmosphere generates from members who are both speaking to their colleagues and performing for the live stream audience watching at home, are worth examining for what they reveal about the specific nature of the political communication that the overnight urgency is designed to produce. A member of Congress delivering a floor speech at midnight about the constitutional urgency of impeaching a sitting president before morning is not primarily addressing the 100 or so colleagues who might be in the chamber at that hour. She is addressing the millions of people who are watching the live stream and who are the real audience for the political communication the speech is designed to deliver. The political message is not just that Trump should be impeached. It is that the situation is urgent enough that members of Congress are in the building at midnight making the case for impeachment. The atmosphere of overnight urgency is itself part of the political message, a communication to the public, to the cabinet officials who hold the 25th Amendment keys, and to Republican members who might be wavering that the situation is serious enough to warrant the kind of sustained institutional emergency response that the all-night sessions represent. The media ecosystem that surrounds and amplifies the Capitol erupts atmosphere, the live streams, the social media commentary, the YouTube channels that are broadcasting the overnight floor speeches with countdown timers and breaking news tickers is itself a significant element of the accountability story. The live coverage of congressional action creates a specific form of accountability for the process itself, for whether the procedural mechanisms are being used to advance the formal articles, whether leadership is making good on its commitments to the overnight urgency, whether the specific conduct that generated the eruption is being addressed through the formal mechanisms that exist for addressing it. The audience watching the live streams is not just consuming entertainment. They are exercising a form of democratic oversight, watching the specific people who hold constitutional accountability responsibilities to see whether those responsibilities are being exercised with the urgency that the moment demands. and the specific attention that the Capitol erupts framing generates for that oversight function is itself a form of institutional accountability that makes the formal process more responsive and more visible than it would be if it were happening in the ordinary procedural rhythms of a legislative day rather than in the extraordinary atmosphere of overnight constitutional crisis. So what does the full picture of the overnight impeachment eruption, the 140 votes, the new articles, the floor speeches, the before morning urgency mean for where the formal accountability effort actually stands and what realistic outcomes the current escalation can produce? The first thing to understand is that the before morning framing describes the atmosphere and the demand accurately even when it overstates the literal timeline for the formal constitutional process. The urgency is real. The fury is documented. The formal actions that the 140 vote result and the new articles represent are genuine constitutional moves. And the political pressure that the overnight sessions and the live coverage are generating is real pressure that is shaping the calculations of the specific political actors who hold the institutional keys to the removal mechanisms that the before morning urgency is demanding. The before morning is not a literal prediction of when the formal removal will happen. It is the most urgent possible formulation of a constitutional demand that has been building across multiple rounds of formal action, and that is being pressed with the maximum available institutional force in the current moment. What the accumulating formal record of impeachment actions, the prior impeachments, the 140 vote floor result, the new articles filing, establishes as a permanent constitutional and political baseline for the accountability effort. Each formal action adds to the record. Each floor vote documents the specific position of each member who participates. Each set of articles creates a formal legal record of the specific conduct that the members filing them have concluded warrants the most serious constitutional response. That accumulating record has significance beyond its immediate procedural consequences. It is the documentary foundation on which future accountability efforts will be built. It is the historical record that will shape how this period of presidential conduct is assessed and understood. And it is the political baseline against which future developments will be measured. The established position of the Democratic caucus that the conduct warrants impeachment, a position that has been expressed in multiple formal votes, and that becomes the starting point rather than the aspiration for any subsequent escalation. The specific way in which the before morning impeachment demand functions as a political communication strategy aimed at the specific actors who hold the institutional keys that the demand is implicitly pressing. The cabinet officials who hold the 25th Amendment keys are watching the Capitol erupts coverage. The Republican members who might potentially provide the votes for a bipartisan majority are watching it. The international audience that is assessing American political stability and democratic resilience is watching it. The overnight urgency is a communication to all of those audiences simultaneously, a communication that the situation is serious enough to have generated the specific atmosphere that the live coverage is documenting. And that communication is itself a form of political pressure that the formal constitutional process generates through channels that are distinct from and complementary to the specific procedural mechanisms that the formal process uses to advance the articles toward a vote. What the Capitol erupts before morning framing ultimately captures is the specific quality of democratic urgency that the constitutional accountability mechanisms are designed to channel and express. The experience of elected officials exercising their constitutional responsibilities in real time in public at the hours of maximum urgency in ways that are visible to the democratic audience that the constitutional accountability function is ultimately designed to serve. The eruption is the formal process being experienced in its most urgent and most visible form. The before morning demand is the urgency of the constitutional moment being translated into the most immediate possible timeline, and the gap between the urgency of the demand and the pace of the formal process, the gap that the framing acknowledges when it describes the before morning urgency, while also recognizing that the formal process operates on its own constitutional schedule, is the gap that the accountability story has been living in since the first impeachment, and that it continues to live in through every subsequent round of eruption and formal action and structural constraint. The final thing to understand about the before-morning impeachment eruption is what it communicates about the democratic resilience of the people pressing for accountability, and about the specific institutional strength that the formal process, however constrained and however slow, represents in the accountability ecosystem. The members of Congress who are delivering floor speeches at midnight, who are advancing formal articles through the procedural mechanisms available to them, who are putting themselves on the record with formal floor votes despite knowing that the structural constraints of the current Congress make majority passage unlikely in the near term, those members are doing exactly what constitutional design asks of them. The House is exercising its constitutional accountability function with genuine urgency. Articles are filed, and the before-morning demand reflects a democratic institution pushed to its limits. The eruption is real, the process is underway, and it will continue until accountability is delivered.